Let's start. Hey everyone, thank you for watching. I'm very excited today. So my name is Yinuo, as many of you know, and today I'm with two very special guests. They are authors of this book. I should have a Chinese translation because I think this is really for the audience in China, but I have the original one. But I suppose the Chinese one is just as good. So one of them is Ken Stanley. Maybe Ken can just wave to everyone. And then the other one is Joe Lehman. Alrighty, okay, so I'm excited for this conversation because I did read the book. I was very excited because I didn't like planning. And this book confirmed a lot of my like non-scientific experience. And I was fascinated to find out this book was actually written in 2015, which is way before, you know, like the whole ChatGPT, rave, and then like this whole wave of development like wowed everybody, I think, in the last 3 months or so, right? But actually this book came about way before that, and you guys actually were involved in AI research way before that as well, and then you were actually both involved in OpenAI too. So in a way there's a lot of foresight for this book without planning. Yeah, so with that I think probably I can first invite each of you to share a bit, like maybe your personal experience like leading to today, and of course and also what led to this book from your own point of view. Maybe I'll just start with Joe because you're on the top of the screen for me. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hello, I'm Joel. So it's been a long winding path to get here. So kind of in the spirit of the book as well, I never expected to be at OpenAI. I never expected to write a book. And the book is about exploration and discovery, and part of the origin of the book. I think Ken can talk more about the origin of the book's central idea. But I was a grad student in Ken's lab, and he pitched me on this idea of novelty search, which is something the book covers in some detail. And I think I remember thinking, this is crazy. I'm not sure this is going to work. What have I gotten myself into? I moved halfway across the country to be a grad student in his lab. And it did work. And strangely, and again, in kind of line with the message of the book, the research led, which was in just computer science and kind of algorithms, led to insights that transcended the book. Sorry, transcended the narrow research into kind of the social sphere and thinking about objectives in general and how so much in society is guided by objectives. And didn't see it coming, but here we are today.
Thank you. Are you a researcher yourself now at OpenAI? Like, what are you doing now?
Oh yeah. So Ken and I both left OpenAI some months ago, and we're at different places now. I'm doing AI research at a place called Carper AI. It's a research lab within another company, confusingly, called Stability AI. So that's where I'm right now.
Oh, I see. Great. Thank you, Joe. And then Ken?
Yeah, so just to echo the story that Joel told, it was a really surprising journey. I think that, I was very interested in how algorithms could do what we call open-endedness, which means continually producing discoveries and innovations on their own, which I thought of as kind of in contrast to what you might think was like conventional machine learning, which would be algorithms that are just trying to solve a problem. It's like, I have this problem, I want this algorithm to solve it. Maybe it can learn how to solve the problem. But something that discovers and innovates on its own, you don't know what it's going to do. So it's open-ended. That's what open-ended would mean. It keeps surprising you. And I was very interested in systems that do that and how they work. And so like the inspiration for those kinds of systems goes back to things like civilization or evolution. Or civilization, if you think about it, we keep on inventing things as a species, and they keep on getting more and more interesting, in some sense more and more complex, going from like, say like the wheel and fire to like space stations and computers, like this huge explosion of innovation. And so it has a lot to do with intelligence, of course, since that whole process rides on top of intelligence. I was interested in algorithmic systems and how they could have that property. But then what happened is, as we discovered these underlying principles, algorithmically that can help to explain how something like that is possible, it became apparent through speaking about them that the lessons that we had discovered are relevant not just to algorithms and AI researchers, but to people in general, because people also arrange their activities and their endeavors around the idea of achieving something, just the way algorithms and machine learning did. Like they arrange them around objectives. And people think like, what am I going to do with my life? Or they think, what is our institution going to do? What is our company going to do? What is the goal? And then how are we going to get there? And the research we were doing was showing in an algorithmic sense that that is often not a good way to arrange exploration if your goal is to do innovation and discovery. And so it just became apparent that this is beyond just an algorithmic issue. It's also a social issue, which is a really weird step. I mean, I was really surprised to have that adventure where suddenly I found myself feeling equipped to talk about social issues because of algorithmic insights. I don't think I've ever heard of anything like that before. And for me, like the big kind of moment that like really propelled me to thinking this is like very important was when I was invited to speak to a group of artists at one point at the Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD. And I, like someone had seen me at a computer science conference and said, oh, these artists would really find this interesting. And I could see it, I could understand. And I said, oh yeah, I see that, you know, because we have like picture breeding and maybe they'll like this message about not having objectives. But I was not prepared for like the level of emotion that like came out of this. You know, I had, because I got to meet people in private meetings after this talk, and some of them were near tears. And they're kind of, what they were saying was, I have not been able to justify to anybody through my entire life why I'm doing what I'm doing. Like, what is the goal of this pointless art that you're doing? How are you going to get a job? Who is going to purchase this thing? Like, what is the point? And said this for the first time, I feel like I can explain. I don't have to have an objective. I'm just doing it because it's interesting. And somehow this made people feel really better. And that's when I realized like, this is a really deep issue. Like people want to talk about this. And it really pervades society. And so I talked to Joel, who I think these ideas were also gelling in Joel's mind as well, because we were aware that like we were getting interest from people about topics outside AI. And we started to just be like, yeah, we should just write this book. I think it was a really strange kind of revelation that like AI researchers would just write this kind of general, almost social critique. But we decided to do that. And I think, you know, I'm glad we did, because here we are 8 years later talking to you. And I could not have imagined things like this would come out of AI research. So it's very nice.
This is the testimony to your own research. How this conversation happens. Yeah, absolutely. No, I went, as you say, because when you know this first, I think in the second graph of your preface, this really touched me. I think that's what you're just saying. You said, but then something unusual happened, as you described. I started to realize the insight wasn't just about algorithms, but also about life, and not just life, but culture, society, how we drive innovation, how we plan for achievement, our interpretation of biology. The list just kept expanding, right? So I think that was basically the genesis of this book. And this is, of course, very profound. You know, I think the book is, I really want to recommend it because as you can see, it's actually very thin. It's a pretty easy read. And then I suppose the Chinese version is very thin as well. So it's an easy read, but actually there's a, I think I saw the link on the famous blogger talked about this is, you know, out of the 5,000 books he's read, and this is among the top 10. So this should be a really worthwhile investment. And I hope you can, you know, at least try to get this book and read it. And then the book is organized in a very interesting way as well. So there's, I'll just read the chapter names to everyone. So there's, you know, the number one is questioning objectives. That's what they talked about, because I think objectives is so prevalent everywhere in our culture, you know, from personal life to business world, you know, to society, to political, right? So like every level. So this first starting with the questioning, and second come to the called victory of the aimless, which I said that's what brought people to tears. And then the third is called the art of breeding art, what kind of generate art. And then number 4 is the false campus. And then fifth chapter is the interesting and the novel. The sixth one is long life, the treasure hunter, which is a very interesting experiment. We'll have them talk about it. And then there's a unhackling education, which I think lots of us are thinking about, because objective I think we were indoctrinated into objective when we were in school. That's where this whole thing started. So the unshackling of education is very interesting on chapter 7, and then chapter 8 is unchaining innovation. So again, it's very interesting word you're using, unchaining. So we think objective is something we use to help us, but actually it probably handicapped us, right? It ended up chaining. So like, how do we unchain that? And number 9 is failure to the mirage. We'll get to that. And then there are 2 very interesting case studies at the end. So it's a pretty simple book, but everyone, every chapter actually it's a very interesting, it's like I think it's like a thriller. You're reading the book. You can just start. Yeah, it starts with a question, and then you want to know, right? So then there's actually like unfolding through the book and talking about it. So since most of course, people who are watching this haven't read the book yet, so I'll just represent them, pretending I haven't read it either. So I'll probably have you talk to us around a few things in the book that kind of like makes the thriller. So I think we'll probably have like 3 parts. One is the questioning part, like where the question comes from. And second, if we may, I want you to describe the few very interesting experiments or cases that you guys have covered in the book. And the third, I want to talk about what does it mean, especially starting with education, because again, lots of people I don't know if you're parents. Are you guys parents?
I am.
Oh, Kenny is. Joe isn't.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you have a control experiment going on. I have 3 kids myself. And as you may know, we started a school 7 years ago. And then so we were immersed in this education issue every day.
Yeah.
And then like objective is definitely a big deal everywhere in education. So on the third part, we want to kind of unpacking about like knowing all that, what does it mean for us, right? So what can we do when we plan our own career or our own life path, not only career, but also how do we think about, if we were parents, how do we think about education for the next generation? Does that sound fair?
Yeah,
Sounds great.
All right. Okay. So we'll start with the first one. Like, can we tell us a bit what started the question? Like, because starting with questioning objective, like victory of the aimless, what data or what kind of, it's like what intrigued you to look at this issue differently? Kind of if you retrace back before the book came about.
Yeah, it was something that was going on in my lab, and I was a professor at the time. That we were interested in. We had a technology for basically generating pictures, which long predates like current modern stuff like DALL-E or Stable Diffusion. It was a long time ago, and we were interested in this idea of breeding pictures because we had this idea that we have this kind of artificial DNA, and then people would be able to use that to then say, have this image actually of children that look a little bit like it, just like your children would look a little bit like you, but also a little bit different. And then you could, from the children, have them have children. And then basically what you're doing is breeding. And this goes back to what I said, when I mentioned that I was interested in open-endedness, because basically we did the experiment because we were interested in how open-ended exploration happens. And we thought that by bringing humans into the loop, like by humans in the loop, I mean, they're the ones doing the breeding, we could sort of piggyback on top of the fact that humans already tend to be open-ended in their exploratory type of behavior. And so we could get a kind of open-ended exploration through this picture space to happen on the internet. And this is like way before all the modern stuff. So, we're talking more than 10 years ago. And so what happened was we put them in the system online called PicBreeder, and they would breed pictures together. Like you could breed something and then I could take what you bred and bred it further and so forth. And that was where we saw a phenomenon that just for me, like completely changed the way that I thought about objectives. And it was totally unexpected. This wasn't why we created PicBreeder. It's not we were thinking, let's figure out a way to show how bad objectives are. It was just, we were just interested in this phenomenon of breeding and seeing what people would do with the representation that we had. But then I just noticed this thing, which was totally crazy, which is that it seemed like the only time people actually found interesting looking pictures was if they were not looking for them, which is really counterintuitive. So it's worth repeating maybe because it's hard to kind of absorb that. But the only way to find something interesting was by not trying to find it inside a PicBreeder. And I noticed this, and I didn't just notice it, I experienced it, because I experienced actually finding things. Like I found a car, it looked like a car. And I knew that I wasn't trying to find a car when I found it. Like that moment when I found that car was really kind of a transformative moment for me, because I was thinking like how this is just different than all of the education that preceded me, like everything I'd learned. This is not how you get something that's meaningful, but it was. And then not only that, but that was how everyone was doing it. And so I had a feeling that there was something profound going on, like really profound. And that was the beginning of the insight that led to the book, but then it filters through, and I should probably hand the baton to Joel, then creating an algorithm based on that insight. Because that's sort of when Joel came into the picture, as I was telling him about this, as he came into my lab around then, and saying we could create an algorithm that works like this, because that's really, as AI researchers, we don't want to just observe behavior, we want to build something. And so we said, let's build an algorithm like this. That led to the novelty search algorithm, and then seeing that actually working is what led to deciding to do the book. And so, I mean, maybe Joel could finish that part of it.
Yeah, go ahead, Joel.
Sure. So yeah, that's where I kind of come into the story with kind of creating together this novelty search algorithm, which is taking the insight that he described that was observed in kind of how humans were behaving in this pick breeder system, and trying to transplant it into something that we could control and replicate and do scientific experiments on more directly. And the key move in novelty search is to create a sort of unorthodox search algorithm. So usually when AI researchers talk about search algorithms, they have like a clear thing that they're looking for. Maybe it's to get a robot to do a certain thing, or to minimize error in a particular way. But there's like an intuitive thing that you're looking for, and you're going to try to follow the gradient of progress towards achieving that goal. And the key move in novelty search is to say, well, what if we created a different kind of search process? What if we created a search process that was not looking for anything in particular, but continually tried to find things different than what the search algorithm had seen before? So just try to continually discover novel things. And on some level, it sounds like a kind of crazy algorithm, maybe just creates lots of junk. But what we found is actually that sometimes, and you can replicate this, and other people have built on this algorithm in lots of different ways. But sometimes searching for the thing you want to find empirically, repeatably, reliably will work worse than not trying to find it. It's sometimes not trying to find something will find that thing more quickly. And it's a little paradoxical, it's a little Zen-like, but also it kind of makes sense. And we started then to see kind of connections between this algorithm and looking kind of through examples in history of how innovation in science and art and so on actually happens.
Yeah, so interesting. Well, if you're interested, I think this is the picture you're talking about. The one with it was starting like a frog and then all the way to a car. It was through, I think this is generated from the pig breeder. Like, is that the product?
Yeah.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think, when you get to the book, you will see there's a lot of other examples that shows here, like how this kind of came about. And I really like the statement that we get things we don't look for, or we think what we're looking for is the result, but the result usually doesn't come. Excuse me, doesn't come from searching. And when I was reading the book, I had this one image in my mind, which is a bit like the rainforest. So if you look at the rainforest, it's a very sophisticated and harmonic structure. But the way it gets there is by no means by design. Like if we had objective of getting a sort of multi-species, something, we'll probably never get a rainforest. But on the other hand, everybody does have a goal. I mean, like every species does have a goal, which is to get more sunlight. It's very basic, but that very basic motive get manifested, through a very elaborate form, right? But the form wasn't by design. If we were searching that form, we could never have found it. But if the objective was just everybody try to get more sunlight, and then you somehow, breed this elaborate, fascinating, incredible structure, which is the outcome. So there is a objective, but the objective is different from the objective we think. I think that's what the second part of the book was telling me. I think you guys have a very interesting example there too, which is the maze. You're trying to, if you were to train something to get out of the maze, if you set the goal as to get out of the maze, that probably breed failure, right? Because then you should try to find what's the straight line going to the exit. But on the other hand, when you design something completely different, it actually gets to the result the fastest. So without giving out what it is, I'll probably hand it to you and to talk about the experiment. I think that's very telling. Maybe Ken or Joe who want to talk about it.
I'm happy to go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the experiment, which is kind of like a philosophical thought experiment in some ways, is about trying to breed a robot this time, instead of breeding pictures, breeding a robot so that it would navigate through different kinds of mazes, starting from maybe really simple mazes that are not very deceptive, so there's no kind of dead ends in them, to more complicated mazes that have a lot of dead ends in them. And the analogy, the philosophical kind of analogy here is that there's lots of different kinds of problems we face in life. Some are more straightforward and some are more ambitious. And what we found was that if you try to breed the robot to reach the end of the maze, then in simple mazes where there's not many twists and turns, following the objective can work and you can get there. So maybe it's more analogous to kind of really simple problems we deal with in life, trying to go from version 1.1 of software to version 1.2 or something like that, or increasing efficiency by 3%. And then you can kind of take that and go to more complicated problems, mazes that have twists and turns, where if you're trying just to minimize as the bird flies distance to the goal, you hit a dead end. And no matter how much effort you put at trying to get it around that dead end, if you're so blinded by this pressure to achieve this particular goal, you just never get there. And instead, if you just try to discover robots that just end up in a different part of the maze, so that the algorithm will keep track of where different robots have ended in the maze. And it will continually try to push search to find robots that are maybe just crashing in different ways. So they're not actually succeeding in some grand sense, but they're just crashing in a different way. And at some point, after you crash in enough simple ways, the only way to actually make any new discoveries is actually to integrate some kind of information from the environment. You actually have to learn how to navigate through a wall, but you learn this skill in a very indirect way. And over time, the maze fills up with all the different ways to kind of to navigate to different parts of the maze. And eventually, even though the algorithm isn't trying to navigate through the maze, it ends up there. And the kind of analogy with how we tend to solve really ambitious problems, like inventing a whole new form of transportation or something, is that all the different people that are doing exploration are discovering new technologies that might lead someplace. There might be a stepping stone to someplace. And we might not never know when we're actually hit to the final ambitious thing we're looking for, but at some point it kind of snaps into place. And so while this knowledge search algorithm was first tried in this really kind of simple domain of just kind of a robot going through a maze, the kind of purpose is kind of like to serve as an analogy or metaphor for how search might work in general.
Yeah, this bears a lot of analogy, again, as a mother and parent, as how like little human learn to walk, right? It's the same thing. They actually learn by falling. They learn by, as the algorithm is by bumping into the wall. And then so like they know once they bump into it, they need to adjust. And that collectively will guide them. Just like how I was interested, I think there's data, I can't quote it precisely, but they're saying during the time when the little human beings learn to walk, they have to fall, I don't know, like 10,000 times or something. It's a very massive number of falling, like maybe not that much. I should find the exact number, but when I was reading it, I was very impressed as how we learn by failing at it. And then, but not by, if we were to design a walking process, which you sort of get to. Similarly, you have an interesting example later too, like a walking robot. But like if we were to design it by saying, okay, you have to put your left foot forward, 30 centimeters, and then the right foot forward another 15, then would have never learned to walk. But that's kind of how our brain would have thought, because our brain tend to think in a straight line. I think like it's a right. So because I think that's how we're programmed. We think a straight line is the shortest way, but it's actually not, because you never get there by the straight line. It has to be a so-called detour, but the detour is actually the shortcut. I think that was so interesting when so this is in the book, this is the data, this is the maze you get to. But I think online I saw some other interesting pictures, but I think in the book there was this one they're talking about how you navigate. Oh, there's this one. I think this is the one they're talking about, right? So instead of trying to get out, because you know where that is, you directly will just go here. But actually, no, it's by bumping into different walls. Yeah, it's very interesting. And on that, I guess you did talk about this two-legged robot. Maybe Ken can talk about that experiment or what that told you around this whole learning objective.
Yeah, I think this two-legged robot, or we call it biped robot experiment, was just an attempt to extend the results that we'd seen in the maze to something that's more relatable, because if we think walking is actually practical, we do want robots to be able to walk. And so let's see if we get an analogous result with the walking robot, which is like, in some ways, it's more surprising maybe to an audience, because you think of walking as kind of like a goal-oriented activity, like get up and go as far as you can. That's your goal. Figure out how to do it. It seems like maybe this is an objective problem, and also from an AI research perspective, normally before novelty search, you probably think of it as an objective, and we would just optimize towards that objective, and that's what we would try to do. But so we said, okay, let's try to do this in this unconventional novelty search way, where what the robot will be rewarded for is not going farther, but just doing something different than it's done before. And it's very similar to the maze, where we're saying let's reward the navigator for going somewhere different than it's gone before, but here for doing something different. So for example, like if you fall on your face, but you fall on your face in a different way than you've done before, then we like that, and we'd like to see you explore more around that kind of falling on your face. But we're not saying you should try to learn how to walk. We never say that. And so the hope and expectation, I mean, if you believe in this principle of novelty search, would be that it would actually get really good at walking, in fact, better than a robot that was trained in a conventional way to just go as far as possible, which actually did happen. So we were able to get this result where you could train better walking gaits for this biped robot by rewarding it for just doing something different without even knowing what it's trying to do. And eventually we just start to walk in a much more smooth and reliable way than the robot that was optimized for going as far as possible. And so that's kind of like just another kind of shock, like to see that. And it's helpful as a way of communicating our insight, but it's also, I think, an illustration of this underlying principle that explains it, which you did a good job to actually articulate, but sometimes we use the word deception to explain what's going on, which is, when you were talking about going down that straight line path, the reason that's bad is because it's actually a deceptive path. It looks right, but it's actually wrong. And the farther you go down it, the more you think you're doing the right thing, until you hit that brick wall and realize you've been deceived. The map was false and it was telling you the wrong thing. And so you ended up realizing that actually you should have gone a way that looked wrong, because the whole world is deceptive. The world is deceptive. And this is going to be true whenever you see a result like the biped robot, which is always kind of shocking, because it's like, it doesn't make sense. You're like, how could it be better at walking by not trying to walk? Deception is always lurking in there as an explanation. It's like the things that lead to walking don't always look like walking, or at least not like walking well. And so to discover those things, like, for example, one thing might be oscillation. That's like a stepping stone to walking, like the idea of going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Like that on its own is not the same as getting from A to B or going from one place to another, but it could be an important discovery if you just recognize it as interesting in its own right. And that could be a stepping stone that could lead to walking. And so it's the explanation is because those stepping stones actually don't look like going farther. It's not like going an inch is actually helping you go 10 feet, is helping you go 10 miles. Those are all very different things. And so the world is deceptive, and this experiment kind of captures that and encapsulates that deception and shows why that's so profound.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting when you talk about deception. I mean, in Buddhism, there's this concept called, I don't know how to translate it. I guess concepts. So, or empty concepts. I'm saying you could call it deception. So the example would be, just using the robot example, is that when we see something walking, we name it walk, right? So we call it walk. But actually it's just two legs moving. Like that's in essence what it's doing. But once we have the concept of walking, we want to design things that fit the concept. And that's when the moment of deception happens, because we're more attached to the concept rather than understanding what it really is. So in Buddhism, this whole thing is talking about, suffering, human suffering coming from hanging on to a concept. And because we want it without seeing the truth. The truth is this two legs moving, like as you talked about, it's basically that. Right. But once we name it something, it become a concept, and then we can compare. Somebody's walking better than the other person, somebody's walking faster than the other person, and then we use that to come back and direct our life. And that's where the human suffering comes from, because that's not what it is. It's just a result rather than the root cause or the reason or right.
That, I mean, it's really interesting. You mentioned Buddhism, that like we do see this kind of theme across cultures, I think, like in human culture of that like the best path is the path where you don't know where it leads. You hear people say this in different contexts, and in history, and we're going back hundreds or even thousands of years. And I think what's kind of interesting is that like this, so it shows that this kind of strain of thinking has existed for a long time, but it hasn't really been demonstrated in this kind of like empirical algorithmic way. I think that's like what's really kind of new here, is it's like almost like an empirical demonstration of a philosophical concept. It's like actually can be shown why this is the case, and it's fully algorithmic. And so I feel like that's kind of what the book is contributing, is to like argue that this is not just a philosophical idea, like this is actually practical, and there's real reasons to believe this.
Right. Yeah, indeed. And I think that's why they were saying that it's actually when I was reading the book, I was fascinated to think about, because even this unplanned objective is somehow, I guess, planned, because, you guys, of course, did experiment, adjust the algorithm and all that. But that sense of plan is different from the traditional sense of plan. So it's the same word, but mean different things. So meaning like when you're kind of let go of the concept and then trying to even do research at a fundamental level, it brought new insights as well. So it's very interesting, like how it is, because sometimes people say, hey, then if that's the case, then why do you do this research? No, you actually do this research, but when you realize I'm not doing research at the concept level, at a deeper level, it's a form of enlightenment as well. Just then that's right. Go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how sometimes, like you said, the attachment to a concept kind of blinds us to what's actually going on. And in particular, that sometimes we use the same word to mean very different things. And so letting go of this one kind of search, which when we think of search, we often think of it as kind of really goal-directed way. And you might think like, okay, that's our only option, just from this kind of binary, like I'm attached to this one concept kind of way of thinking. And so you think, if I let go of that, then all I can do is random kind of mumbling around. But yeah, there are actually different kinds of search processes that are kind of entangled often with, when we might think of biological evolution as a directed search, it's survival of the fittest. We might think of scientific innovation as like a genius scientist alone by themselves, coming up with this next profound insight just by sheer force of will. But in reality, there's different kinds of searches. And one contribution I think of the book is to highlight the concept of what you might call like a non-objective or divergent search process, which is where you have lots of different agents all following their own compasses, kind of contributing to a bigger project, which could ultimately lead to finding something really ambitious. And you can start to think about how to structure those kinds of searches, which is kind of the domain of how you might try to design a scientific funding program to make innovation happen, or how you, as we'll talk about later, probably design education systems and so on.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think this whole concept of letting go, there's a lot of misunderstanding of it. So like, because I got those questions a lot, because I never say, okay, if I let go, should I just not do anything? I just lie around? No. So what you're letting go, you're not letting go of, I think there's I think this probably Michael Singer put in very precisely, saying we're not letting go of life. We're letting go our reactions to life, or our our attachment to concepts, right? So it's that we're letting go of that, because once you let go of that attachment to the deception, I think can use that word or the concept, then you realize you have a chance to see the real stuff, and then that actually bring you incredible insights. Yeah, before we get to education, I think one thing I want to talk about is the idea of innovation, which you guys talked about here too. I'm sure since the book has published, you guys were invited to a lot of talks, and then that must be a very common question of how to best innovate, both as an individual and then oftentimes now as an organization. What are some of the suggestions or recommendations you would give them, when this question comes about?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess I could start that. I think when it comes to innovation, what the book is suggesting is that it's important to be able to do things sometimes because they're interesting. And this is very aligned with the conversation we just had, which is kind of to say something like, follow things for the path, but not for the destination, in a sense. It's like, I'm doing this because it's interesting. I don't know where it leads. And I think the problem is that, so things that you do because they're interesting often are stepping stones that open up new playgrounds of opportunity. And eventually you discover things that are actually useful when you do things like that. But the problem is that just finding a playground, which is when the interestingness stage comes in, is often something that organizations don't really appreciate or want you to do. So it's like, you don't want to tell your supervisor or your boss, I'm just going to do this because it's interesting. They want to know, how does it affect the bottom line? Why are you doing this? Not just because it's interesting, but the problem is that we don't know what it's going to do. And that's how innovation happens. And so organizations really struggle, I think, with this idea of letting people do things just because they're interesting, and how to actually grapple with what is interesting and what is not interesting. And so it would be, I think, so this is within, by the way, the part of the organization that I think has a job of doing innovation and discovery. An entire corporation, for example, is not all about that. So there are parts of the company that shouldn't be doing that. But the part that is about innovation should be doing that. And within that part, I think there's a lot of fear of doing stuff like this. And part of it is that we are not willing to talk about what's interesting. We want objective measures. So, what we want is show me an objective measure of progress, so I know you're going in the right direction. Then I'll let you continue your project. But the problem with interestingness is you can't measure it that way because you don't know where we're going. So there's nothing to measure. And so we're afraid to just discuss the interestingness itself. Why is it interesting? And this is why it's not random lying around doing nothing. It's because you can still be very motivated by passion when you're motivated by interest. It's still very much an expression of yourself. It's just that you can't measure to show that it's going in the right direction because you don't know what direction it's going. But that doesn't mean that I can't communicate to you, if you're my colleague, for example, to explain to you why this is interesting. The fact that we don't allow ourselves to have these conversations, I think, is one of the things that does hold back innovation-centered organizations, is that they're just afraid to discuss interestingness in general. And so we can't have those conversations, so we can't open up those playgrounds, and we can't open up those stepping stones that then would lead to things that are productive. And lastly, I just want to say that, of course, there are some constraints that are necessary. If we're trying to develop new software, then, I probably don't want to just explore a new breakfast cereal. There's some things that are probably not interesting with respect to the mission of the organization. That's okay. We can discuss that. There can be constraints, but we still need to be able to pursue things that are interesting within those constraints.
Yeah. I wonder, do you, because this book has been published for a while, have you seen organizations taking up this advice, or or doing things slightly differently, like discussing interesting things, or set up mechanism to do it and have some results? Have you seen that?
We have heard from people who said that they've started companies, things like that work on our principles. And some of them, have been very successful. It's hard to say it's because of the book, but some people have expressed gratitude for the book as part of their formula for success. But I'd also say, I think it's important also to say that a lot of people have told us they want to do this, but they can't, which I think might be an even stronger kind of lesson that Joel and I have learned over the years, that, we are all kind of embedded within a hierarchy and a bureaucracy. And within that, you can have someone who actually is in control of a lot of resources, like say someone who controls a research lab, but they're still embedded within this hierarchy where they have to explain to the CEO or explain to the government or whoever they answer to, like why it is that like this is the thing we're investing in right now. And they feel impeded by that to just be like, well, we're just doing things because they're interesting. It's very hard to say that. And so a lot of the kind of response that I would get would be, I want to do this. I really want to do this, but I can't figure out how to do this. And I feel like this is it's a trap that we've sort of exposed by opening up this conversation that many of us find ourselves in, which is kind of why it's necessary, I think, to have discussions like we're having right now, is because I think to get out of this trap, you have to have some amount of buy-in to this, the general idea that sometimes it's important to do things without a clear objective destination. And the only way to get that going is to begin to expose these ideas and try to justify them by having a discussion like we are right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So interesting, because I think the key word you mentioned just now is this word of fear, which I think we'll go explore more in education. I think education, basically the modern education system is based on fear. That's my biggest criticism, because then it's when with fear, exactly, and people feel like I cannot talk about it, because as if interesting is a positive word, but there is always a negative connotation, which means you're slacking, right? It means you're not serious, like you're playing, you're not doing the work. I think that word does come with it, because I think, or people would think being interesting is a luxury. Like, when you are like, when you are sort of born in the rich family, like then you can be interesting. Like, we as common people, we can't afford to do it. And even sometimes my talks, when talk about education, people give me the same comments. So, oh, I agree with it, but I'm a very common person, and that's why I can't afford to be interesting. But that's probably the biggest misnomer. I'll share one example. When you're saying, you mentioned that so my son, when he was 10, and we were starting, we're trying to buy a second sort of a used car, and he was asking me, as a mom, why can't we buy a tank? Because it would look really cool if you drive a tank to school, and if I can be a tank. And as a 10-year-old boy, that's very normal, right? So my first reaction was like, what kind of nonsense is that? But then I was like, wow, yeah, like, I have to give myself credit. I didn't say that. I said, wow, it's an interesting idea. Like, yeah, why can't we? Like, why don't you go look up the price to buy a tank? So he went on eBay or something. So he searched. He said, and then he did a bunch of very interesting research. He was 10. Like, he came back. He said, "Oh, Mom, we can't buy a tank." I was like, "Why?" He said, it's going to destroy the road, because the whole belt thing. But then I was like, well, maybe there's tanks on wheels, right? And he said, yeah, there actually are tanks on wheels, because there are options. But he did some more research. He came back and said, "Oh, Mom, we still can't buy a tank." I was like, why? Because he said the reason is that the fuel efficiency is too low. You get a whole, I really didn't know that. He did all this research that, because you get a full tank of gas. I didn't even remember the number, but he did all the calculation. You can only go 1 mile or something like that. Like, it just, so it's too expensive. And then I think he was calculating, he was like 80 times that of a car or something like that. It was so interesting. But that I want to use that example to say it doesn't cost us money to have that conversation, right? So it's not like you have to be born in the rich family, or you're already a professor, you already got your PhD, whatever, you're writing a book. All we need is to relax a bit, like, and to be a bit open-minded. Is instead of saying nonsense, just go back to your room, do your homework. You could say, hey, tell me more, like, why? And I was fascinated by all that thing like a 10-year-old can do if you just be okay. And I think that comes at no cost at all. It's free. Yeah, it does take some of your time. But I just exactly as you said, but like, we are so afraid to even have that conversation. Like, even at home, like, yeah, in companies, I can understand, sure, there are hierarchies and all that. So but even that kind of conversation, we almost carry that sense of stress or hierarchy or structure into our personal life. I think that almost strengthens the current system, right? So Anyway, I want to just share that to say the fear point is spot on, because we
Oh.
were, we're living under such
Yeah.
collective concept that we even know that might not be right, but we feel it's too risky to deviate from it.
Yeah,
I mean,
really.
Go
Yeah, first of all, I really appreciate you sharing that story. It's just kind of a beautiful story. I didn't expect today to hear kind of, all these facts about tanks. But it's beautiful for many reasons, but one is that it's, like you said, like it highlights the fear nature, the kind of instinctual response to kind of like say, no, that's impractical, we can't do that. And it's particularly in education, or like a child who's growing, to allow them to play and explore and kind of use their intrinsic motivation, curiosity, to actually do like lots of sophisticated things that otherwise would just kind of been shut down. I think it's really interesting what you're saying about how, without much thinking about it, we might be tempted to simply act, through just swatting down this idea. Like kind of like maybe because we got swatted down at some point as kids ourselves, it's kind of like this generational kind of thing as well, probably. But that play as adults as well is really important, and the play in the space of ideas in particular. But you're right, there's this attitude that play is a luxury. A really hard worker would kind of just stick to just grinding out, like working 12, 13, 14-hour days, with a single-mindedness, determination to the objectives. But one beautiful thing about the book and the kind of discussion that Ken and I are trying to kind of continually invite is that it actually can serve the bottom line sometimes. It actually, like, there's not necessarily like a tension here, that sometimes play in some domain, maybe like the area that's doing R&D, or like you're saying, that there's lots of areas of our lives where we can explore this, without any cost potentially. And it could just make our lives more fun and also potentially get us to better places.
Yeah, indeed. I like the word play. And then maybe that's a good segue into the education part. I think you said it very clearly in the beginning of chapter 7. I think I'll read it. I think it's well written. It's saying like how the book began. We pointed out how almost everything in our culture is guided by objectives. They're so universal in our lives and our jobs that we hardly see the need to question them, but they're always affecting us, driving and coloring almost everything we do. And that, of course, going down very deeply on how education is based on this objective and design as well. Maybe tell us a bit what's like when what are you trying to communicate in the unshackling education chapter? Like, what are the elements you see that's wrong, which I think there are many, but from your research point of view. And when unshackling, what do you mean? Like, maybe, tell us about it. Ken?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I think there's kind of two levels where this comes into play in education. One is at the level of the institution, I think, which is to say, like, how schools themselves are rewarded or incentivized. Like, what does it mean to be a successful school? And we kind of measure the performance of schools against objective measures. And this creates this culture within education where everything is sort of test driven because of that. It's like, that's how we know that the school is doing well. So the school goes to the test. And what this tends to do is cause convergence across the education system, I think, which is that all the schools end up doing the same thing because they're all being measured in the same exact way and they're all competing on that measure. And so we converge to a local optimum, or basically deceptive, because there's, like, in principle, there's another way to do things, but we're too afraid to go towards it because it might cause the score to go down for the institution and it'll look worse. And then we can't afford to take any risks at all, because that would actually make us look like we should get fewer resources, how all the teachers should get fired, whatever it is. And so nobody will try anything. So there's no exploration. Now, of course, we have to be somewhat careful to not do things that are crazy. Like, the kids deserve to get an education. We should have some degree of like basic checks to make sure that things are not going off the rails. But like, having it so objective does mean, I think, that like we are converging to a point where there isn't this kind of rich, playful discovery happening across a giant system. If you think about it in the United States or in China, like how big the education system is across like hundreds of millions of people. Like, that's a system that has the space to try all kinds of ideas. but it will tend not to happen because of this convergence, because it's objective. And so that's the first thing. And the second thing is at the individual level, like how does it affect you as a child, as an individual, to be constantly faced with everything that you do is on this path that's been set out for you with a sequence of objectives or milestones that you have to go through. And what this does, I think, over time is it destroys that playful creativity that your son exhibits, which kind of explains the fear to some extent. Like, where does this fear come from that we adults have? So even talk about something like a tank going to school, it's like that might be like, why does the child feel so free and liberated, but we feel so scared, like to even think about it? Like, I think it starts to come in because the educational system imposes a subjective ideology on children, so that we're forced to think for years and years, decades actually, that like the only way to actually get a reward is to do exactly as is expected of you from an objective perspective. And that means that like all these kinds of channels of exploration start getting gradually just clamped down and shut off. And that means that you lose that talent, which obviously is important for things like science, to say, oh, well, actually, like this is a crazy idea, but I will follow it because I feel very interested in trying. And what causes that? I mean, over time, I think, yeah, it starts to get lost. And the education system takes some of the blame. I mean, there's probably other factors involved with just maturation in general, but some of the blame goes to the system that's so objective. It's also one other thing about that, I think, is that you learn better when you learn non-objectively. At least this is my theory. The book doesn't really touch on this, but if you learn it because it's intrinsically motivated, like I want to know about math because I think it would be interesting if I could do something with that math, and I don't know where this is necessarily going, then I'm going to be better at math than if it's just that there's a test I have to take like 1 week from now, and that's why I have to know all this math. And so this makes it harder to create really masters, I think, in different domains, because I think masters come from intrinsic motivation, which is self-propelled exploration. And people need to have the liberty, like as children, to learn that that's actually like a good thing to do with yourself. Like with my kids, I try to make them feel really good about following whatever path. You know, even if to me it's like strange, why do you want to explore this really weird thing? But like they should know that like the intrinsic reward is really high just for satisfying their own curiosity, because that's how they're going to become really good at things. So that's the other thing that I think is really important in education. So I think education deserves a huge discussion and an overhaul based on these insights.
Yeah, I completely agree. If I could say, sorry, what was that?
I said I should give you a high five.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Go ahead,
yeah,
Joe.
yeah. If I just add two things to it, I mean, I agree with everything that Ken said, and I think like one thing is kind of even thinking about on the meta level of, so you can mention like the individuals, the institutions, and the objective that's guiding those institutions, like of these test scores, just questioning that metric itself. Even if you did really, really well by that metric, is that really preparing you for a dynamic world that requires creativity, innovation to survive? Things are changing really rapidly today in the career space and life space. And I think I carry some resentment, I think, towards the education system for what Ken said, is it kind of winnows out that creative spirit. And then when you actually, I was really good at passing tests, you know, that was, I was like, I took a lot of pride in that. And then you hit the real world, you know, I'm doing research with Ken and his research lab, and it's just so different. It's so different. The real world doesn't have these predefined sort of, you know, tests you take that you progress up some ladder. You actually have to figure out for yourself lots of things. And then there's a level, I think, in between the kind of the students and the system, which is the teachers. And that's another thing that we talk about, I think, in the book, which is that there's all this human potential that teachers have. They've learned all this hands-on experience about how children learn, and then this kind of incentive for them to make students pass tests just crushes that. And if you don't kind of produce students that are maximizing these tests, then maybe you don't get a bonus, maybe you get fired. But you are yourself kind of coerced into this direction, just like the students. And it's really sad because there's so much creativity, expertise, humanistic knowledge that educators have that is also being squeezed out. And yeah, like Ken said, like what could we do if we unleashed that, all that creativity to kind of explore different ways of teaching, different students and so on. And as Ken said, helping to really lean into the individuality of the students and what directions they would like to go, what they could actually explore. And I also share that belief that would lead to just better outcomes probably on the tests, but also maybe more importantly, more preparation for the critical thinking skills and passion that life itself requires.
Yeah, yeah, I so agree. I don't know if you guys know my background, because of course, I didn't start in education. I would say I was, I was a pretty successful. I was good at taking tests too in China system, which says something. And, but then it was really, I started to think about education after, like, I spent 10 years at McKinsey, and then I was doing more sort of a management job or in Gates Foundation and all that. And then of course, that's when my first son turned 6, I didn't start looking at schools, and I realized, okay, there, the model I grew up in not only didn't change, it becomes stronger. So it's like an even stronger machine of anxiety producing, I would say. And I said, I don't want to be part of that game. And I know what that game is. And then, so that's when we started our school. It has been 7 years now. And then our physical school has about 400 kids up to high school, middle school, and we're trying to open high school. But we also have a parent community, because there are so many parents, because physically you might not come to the city, and the parent community has like 20,000 parents. But then I just realized how, exactly as you said, because my reflection is like, because nobody's happy in education. Kids are not happy, teachers are not happy, parents not happy. And then once they exit the system, the employers are not happy. Like, I was like, then who's winning? Like, this is a system that nobody's winning. But then who's the enemy? Like, are we victims? If we are victims, we're victims of whom? And then that's when I think I really echo what you're saying, is we're victims of this deception, right? Or victims of our own fear. Because the deception or the concept of education over the years, probably after the Industrial Revolution, is that education is somehow like a track. You have to get on a certain track, and then if you fall off the track in the middle, you'll die. Right? So it's a track on the cliff, sort of like on the ridge, so to speak. And then so like that's our image or our concept of education. There are different ranges. Like, it goes to this kind of school or that kind of school. You go whatever. So like, but you have to get on the track when you're 3 years old, and then you have to keep going on that track. But the reality is it's an open plain. Right, so there is no track. A track were made by people, or once we start walking somewhere, we make it a track. And then if we're really objective, looking at all the human advancement or the societal changes are done through that. It's never produced through some kind of mass production track. But despite all those facts, we're somehow so indoctrinated in this whole track version of the world. And so I think that was exactly that, is the deception. So that's why your book is so interesting, because the book is, of course, starting from like to a computer scientist or like AI scientist, but you're talking about how you can use data or use experiment or actual algorithm outcomes to prove that's a deception. There is no such track, or the track you think you designed are bogus. They don't work. Like, what actually works is something different. So that's also so profound. But the whole tracking thing is so I think in the last 7 years I spent a lot of energy talking about it. Like, it's not a track, but it's often sometimes it's not very convincing. Maybe like Joe or like you, people will say, hey, you took a track, like, you succeeded, you were good at taking tests. Like, how can you turn around to say, hey, now you don't take tests? So it was a bit of a dilemma I'm in. So I wonder, how do you respond to that? Like, when you were talking about this thing, they would say, hey, you guys are professor already, you get grants, like, you're doing this kind of research. Of course you can say, but I'm not there. Like, I'm curious, how would you respond to that?
I mean, I would say that whatever ability to express creativity that I've had the privilege of exhibiting has been despite the system, not because of it. I guess that's how I would say it. And it's, one thing that was really interesting to me, this is like more of a personal thing, was that I didn't realize that creativity was actually like a good thing maybe until grad school, So, I mean, I go through the entire, public education system in the country. And then through college, like undergraduate college in the United States, to the age of like 22, still, I thought, like, there's not really a use for being creative. Like, if I look at the reward system that I've been in, Like I knew that I liked having ideas. I used to think in high school, I would think, oh, ideas are really cool. Like I have a lot of ideas. I'd write them down, but there's not really a use for ideas. Like it doesn't help you at school at all to have any ideas. And then you keep on moving up by not like sharing those ideas. You just do what the teacher says you should do and try to get good at that. But then something around like, this is getting a PhD now around the age of maybe 24, maybe 25, 24. It just hit me that like I suddenly it could be useful to be creative. And I just think, so yeah, it's just suddenly the system around the PhD level, like maybe in the middle of the PhD level, starts to actually recognize that somebody should actually think about an idea. And that to me is, so to me, that's like, okay, that's why I was able to eventually be successful in this, because the system eventually does recognize there's some value to these things. Like you start having to publish, there's some pressure to actually do something creative, but it's still terrible in my view that it took 25 years before I would even realize. Like I remember thinking at the age of 25 that, wow, it actually could be useful to have an idea. Like what kind of, is it pathetic we live in a world that would be like a revelation? It's like, oh, it might actually be a good thing that I have ideas in my head. This can't be optimal, even if I came out okay in the end. Like that's just not healthy. And it could have been probably better if I had realized that sooner, and that if the system had let me at least feel some appreciation for having some ideas and being able to express them.
Yeah. Joe?
Yeah. I think there's a certain kind of punitiveness in saying, because I had to go through this, really crucible of tests, therefore you should also have to do it. And I think it's also true that it's difficult when you have, how do we organize education to recognize that maybe there are differentials in talent and ability, and we do have to say that there's only X amounts of places in maybe a top university or something. And so like navigating that is delicate, and it's really easy to impose, this very standardized test kind of methodology to kind of decide who gets to go there. But it's also not very principled. So I think one frustration I have with a lot of institutions like education, let's say, is that there's not like actually a coherent feedback loop where you test some of these assumptions. And part of this goes to kind of what Ken said, which is that when there's not room for exploration, because maybe there's one metric that's being driven at the top, just some test for how good students are, that makes the education system kind of converge. But really what you want is a lot of exploration, lots of different kinds of metrics and tests, and maybe it's obviously not an easy problem. And it's not that I'm an expert in education and so that I can just kind of say, here's the solution. But it does seem like we should design things so that they improve over time. And like you're saying, it's kind of strange when you're trying to figure out who wins in a system and everyone seems to be displeased. But there's just received wisdom right now that we need to have these objective, simple measures to guide everything. And part of what we're trying to do with the book is that, yeah, like you said, like providing empirical evidence that really it actually doesn't work. And it maybe takes some time for that to filter through to the level of institutional change. But hopefully it does, because yeah, I share Ken's frustration that the value of creativity was not something I really encountered, likely also till graduate school.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I'm actually in Japan now. The reason is I'm here for 4 months they have this exchange program for scholars to look at Japanese education. So I'm looking at Japanese education. I was blown away as well, because one of the prerequisites of coming is that you know nothing about Japan, which I qualify. Although maybe I look Asian to you, but I'm not Japanese. But then it was very interesting. Like I want to echo the point that Ken said, like it's a massive system. Like, you have, but everybody trying to almost to be homogeneous. And then so you could say when the system is massive, you actually should have a lot of room for experimenting, but actually you see the opposite. And I find even the more opposite in Japan, because Japan have an even bigger problem is like it's aging. So you have fewer number of kids. This year they only have 800,000 new birth, which is I think 10% of China. And then like it's very low. I don't know the data for the US. But US is definitely more on the growing side with immigrants and everything. So it's a shrinking population. So you would have thought, okay, then people should be more anxious about making education. Because at the end of the day, education, as you talked about, is about human capital, right? So like what the reason we would talk about it is because we see a lot of waste in human capital as the way it's being structured, as Ken said, by the age 25, you realize, oh, it's actually useful to be human. It's like wonderful. And, but what I realized was so interesting. I see two parts, and one is Japan is probably, it's you would think logically when you have fewer kids, you would have more sense of urgency to be more creative. But actually it went to the opposite, because every family has only one child, most of them. And then the system, the old, there are so many more old people in the system. So the older the society, actually, the more conservative it becomes. So and almost there's more fear in the system, which is very shocking to me, which I had the opposite hypothesis before coming. And you see kids going to all those basically, after school tutoring centers, like a Kuman equivalent everywhere in Japan. If you go to a subway, there's all advertisements for this kind of after school tutoring, one-on-one tutoring, group tutoring. And it's massive, all the kids go there. And then so this whole deception thing is so strong. As an outsider, I try to keep this outsider view, which I think is what you guys do as a good researcher as well. You try to say you keep a bit of distance and see what, because once you're in the system, you tend to absorb. You feel like, okay, everything, all my neighbors are going, so it must be, be natural to go. But actually, this view I was like, wow, there's something wrong in the system. And then luckily my host is a Tokyo University professor. So he does education research and he realized it's a big problem. So his way, we were discussing how to change. And his way of changing, which is very exciting too, is because you can change, it's almost similar to what your book was saying, because you would have thought, okay, the way to change it is to persuade people, right? So you do policy advocacy, you talk to the old guys. It doesn't work. They don't want to listen to you. And like he said, the only way to change is to start doing something different without getting their approval, right? So once you start doing something, so they actually, just yesterday was actually very current. They launched something called the Zen University, Zen, which is an online university, because the whole current university has this entrance exam system, all the way down to primary school. You have to be good enough to get to a middle school, be good enough to get to a high school, and then once you get to there, you can apply. So it's a very much again, going back to the deception path, it's a path as well designed, and you have to be on that path. So the way he was doing, I'm going to get an online university, and then you can just go anywhere, and it's cheap. And then they get accreditation, they get a group of people who agree or disagree with the current system to do it. They just launched it last night, actually. It was very fascinating. And then they'll probably start recruiting in 2025. And I found that interesting as well. Is that how, almost back to what your book is saying, even when you are facing that problem, if you are trying to solve the education problem, when you're trying to unshackle it, the way to do it is not by objective. It's not by trying to unshackle or throw a bomb at it. It doesn't work, but rather he did something different, which is, I think, also a way of sort of echoing what you're saying. If you start doing something different, or just basically what the robot is doing, if you start learning to fall different ways, and that's the way to get it. So I find it inspiring too. So you get two extremes. You see this whole system there, but you also see the people trying to do things which kind of is agreeing with what your book is promoting. Is that you almost, the objective of getting innovation done should be a deeper objective as well. Right? Yeah.
I mean, it's a very important point. I think that fear underlies a lot of the intransigence in these systems. There's deception and fear are very related to each other. And there's a security blanket that comes with having an objective. You feel better. And it's okay, well, the world is systematic and I know how the system works and I can just follow the system. And I feel less afraid of all of the sort of unpredictable randomness of the universe is not coming in at me and threatening me. And so I think it's important to acknowledge and relate to this feeling, of fear that comes with exploration. Of course, people are going to feel afraid, and even to admit that sometimes it's warranted to be afraid. It's you don't have to explore with every aspect of your life. Some things, it's okay to be safe if that's what you want to do. I think what's important is to be aware of the choice you're making, though. So it's like you're not just being objective because that's just what people do. It's because you just chose to do it. It should be that it was a choice, and you understand that there's an alternative. And at an institutional level, I think there are some places where there's less room to explore. Like, for example, changing an economic system might be too dangerous, just to see what happens, because it has to affect the whole system. And so you don't want to change the entire system of the country. Just see what happens. We might learn something interesting, or we might all start, have an economic collapse. And so it's just not worth the risk, and the fear is warranted. But so we have to take this as think about it practically and not be unrealistic. It's just saying it's like everybody should just go off and do whatever they think is interesting, and nobody should be afraid of anything. Of course, there are things to be afraid of, but I think that if we are careful about it, create protected pockets, then we can try things, and we just have to be thoughtful about that. And like in education, like those pockets can be individual schools or institutions that do some experiments, but don't necessarily give up on everything that we believe is important. And so
Right.
it's possible to go halfway and to do some experimentation. Your school is not the kind of thing where everyone's going to die if you don't do this standardized test for every month of the year or something like that. So we can try some other things and take a little bit of risk. And I think that's all we're asking. It's not to completely throw away education as we know it, everybody just does whatever they want all day and there's no textbook or anything, but it's to just have enough room so that we can do this without enormous amounts of fear. But acknowledge that, of course, it's scary to be exploring, but it is necessary for there to be advancement, for there to be exploration. So, you have to take some amount of risk in order to actually have some amount of gain. And that's part of, I think, what our book is about, is basically about some amount of risk. And that should be acknowledged.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, indeed. I think it's not a binary thing, right? I think that's another deception people fall into, as if, if I don't adhere to this, it means I completely gave up. No, there's it's always a balance. There's a middle road. I think that's what the ancient Asian philosophy is about. There is this middle road, and where so it's non-binary. But I think that's the thing. The fear is driven by this binary thinking, as if we didn't do that, then you die. That's really
right.
That's our whole kind of how the empty concepts or deception works. And then that's so like realizing that, hey, we're not dying, I'm still breathing, I'm okay, and my kids are still
right.
I think having that, as you said, kind of face it is an important step. All right, I think I have two questions left, and I'll just give it a preview so people know what's coming. I think one, I want to understand from both of you, like, since you've realized this yourself, what adjustment you have done to your own life or to your own way of approaching your career, your thinking, or for Ken, your kids. And the last question I want to have is around this whole era of AI. As we said in the beginning, because when you were writing this book, this isn't a hot topic yet. I'm sure it's hot in the AI area, but it hasn't spilled to the public. But in the past few months, this has definitely changed. So I think a lot of people having questions as how do we be, in the age of AI. So I think the last one I want to hear from you guys, who has basically a lifetimer AI, to give our audience a bit of input or suggestions. So I'll start the first one, which is like, since you realize the problem, you may probably even earlier than 2015, because 2015 is when the book got published. What have you done different in your own life? Like when you think about your career, or approaching your daily challenges or your objectives, because I'm sure you still have objectives. Like, how have you adapted your way of setting objectives to yourself, and then maybe then to your kids as a parent? Maybe start with Joe. Yeah,
it's interesting because I think I never expected when I started grad school that the research that I would do would actually change my own philosophy of life. But certainly it has. Maybe it's not that surprising. If you think about an idea for long enough with enough intensity, then you generalize it. And so that it's, it's become kind of obvious to me that the objective level of thinking seeps in at a lot of different layers. And some of it's kind of tricky to actually, even knowing this, it's tricky to kind of get out of that. So as an academic, you kind of might watch your citation count, how many citations your papers are getting. And it's it's interesting because even knowing that trying to chase after citations is a kind of pitfall, which I think it is. Still, it's just psychologically the pressure around you, everyone talking about how many papers they have at these different conferences kind of seeps in. So it's like a difficult psychological thing, I think, to fully embody this. Maybe it's impossible to fully embody it. But when I make career decisions, I do try to be open to making dramatic changes. And even though the kind of the next step to follow often would seemingly kind of come from what was previously done. And that's also difficult to do. I think, as both you and Ken mentioned, like that there's a fear that maybe drives sticking to objectives, but there's also a fear of exploration, just the uncertainty of exploration. And so I think it's a lesson that I could continue to learn, but I do take it seriously, and it has changed my life, and for the better, I'd say.
So has that directed some of your changes? Like, I think you probably, after that, you joined OpenAI and you left, right? So like then I guess, is this underlining thinking around some of your career choices as well?
Definitely, yeah. Part of what precipitated my leave from OpenAI is I've become interested in a different topic of research. I really care about open-endedness, it being really interesting, but also I just found myself kind of like open-endedness is about often about AIs that create, innovate, and so on. And I've been really interested about you could say like the open-endedness of the individual, of how psychology determines our life and how machine learning and psychology interact. And so, yeah, post OpenAI, I've been trying to explore that space and try to find where I want to go within there. And I think without this kind of thinking about objectives, and it might be more difficult for me to really make that kind of dramatic change. But if that's where my interests lie, that's where my passions lie, I could try to fight it. I could probably keep doing the research I was doing, but it probably wouldn't be actually as good. And I would suffer a bit, and maybe actually the research itself would suffer.
Mm-hmm. All right. Great. Okay, Ken.
Yeah, for me, I think it kind of, like all of the insights in the book, kind of reinforced maybe some latent personality trait that I already had. Like I guess I just don't like being told what to do, which is sort of like having objectives imposed on me, which is what the education system does, but a lot of other things do. And so I guess that was just sort of a personality trait, but then feeling like, oh, well, actually, there's a good justification for feeling this way. Like that, it made me maybe trust my instinct more, that I should just do what's interesting. Of course, but carefully, because like sometimes that can be dangerous, but carefully think about what's interesting. And then like, yeah, I can trust my gut instinct in some cases. And, I think it is reflected in things like, recently, like what I did after OpenAI, I started a company, and the company's idea is to create like a serendipity network for people. So it's very motivated by the book, actually. But if you look at that in the context of my career, it's kind of crazy because it's not actually like doing academic research. So goodbye citations, goodbye publications for like an indefinite period of time. Like it's kind of a crazy move in an academic career. But it just, I think like the book made me think like, well, I just see that this is like the track. If I just continued along the track I was on, that would be an objective thing. Like I understand how to maximize that reward signal. Like it's saying, I need to maximize citations, put out papers and get publications and so forth. And that would be very objective. Like I know what I'm doing and I'm already like sort of skilled at that. But I believe in my own interestingness instinct. And this seemed like the really interesting thing that like makes sense for me to do right now. And I probably am somewhat being informed by all the thinking in the book to be able to make a choice like that at my age, which is like a little bit late to like do something like a U-turn like that. And so that's for me. You also asked about my children.
Yeah. How old are they, by the way? How old are your children? 3
and 8, 2 boys. And I think it comes into my mind more for my 8-year-old. Like 3-year-old's so young that it doesn't really, there's not much to really do there. But the 8-year-old, he's following all kinds of passions, and I just like it really affects me a lot, I think, in how I treat him, because I see his creative instincts like growing, and they're very kind of arbitrary from my perspective. Like one thing he likes to program like music dance videos. Like he like puts little cartoon characters that he invented into these music videos, and part of it is like he has to do some programming, so I think that's really good. But part of it is he's just like borrowing soundtracks and animations that already exist, and so I'm like, what's the point of that? But then because of the book, I'm like, he really has a feeling for this. Like, this is interesting to him. Like, he makes me watch these videos all the time. So I watch these like little cartoons dancing around, and I'm like, he really finds this very interesting, and I can see it could be interesting. And so I'm just like, I just want to just like, totally rocket charge that particular instinct of his and not get in the way, even though I don't really understand exactly what the point is, but there's no objective. So it's just like, yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. Like, I love the fact that you're doing this. It's so interesting and it's so entertaining. Like, I really enjoy watching, and I just want him to feel like really, really empowered to just do the thing that he's finding interesting. Because I just assumed that that is going to lead somewhere interesting. Like, as he matures and builds on that, like, I have no idea where this leads, but it's creative. So I think he's going to discover things and be a unique person because of it.
Yeah. So this cracks me up because it's just last night, my son, so my oldest son is 13 now, like the one buying a tank. So he's into almost the same thing, like, it looks very silly and childish, but he showed me something like one of his assignments. He was, he spent like 3 hours in his room doing that last night. So he showed me, he was so happy because he basically made a bunch of Peppa Pig videos and then but matched with different music. Okay, so that was one episode where there's the Peppa Pig teacher is Gazelle is doing an international day, and then so all the kids came and he matched up with the national anthem of North Korea and USSR. He's in the area, he knows something about politics now, and it's just like it cracks me up. And then he was matching all this, like it's and then anyway, so he was like, wow. I had exactly the same reaction. I was like, my first instinct is still like being so much in the system, like it's funny, but like, what's the point? But I'm saying, and then but like my son was like, wow, hey mom, you laughed, right? So yeah, I said I did, and then I guess that's good enough, right? So yeah, but indeed, I think but that's I guess my learning, I mean, which is reinforced in this book, as a parent, if their parent listen to this, is like, maybe our best thing to do is not to do anything, so to shut up, like learn to shut up, and then when things happen, as Ken said, just say, oh, this is fascinating, good job, I like it, I laughed, and that's it. And then just let it go. And then, so at the minimum, even if it didn't lead to anything, because I think, in the back of our mind, we'll say, oh yeah, I can do that for once, but what if it happened 10 times? Because again, that goes to how our mind works. We tend to make these movies, and movie kind of keep going. and then just say, like, even if it doesn't lead to, this he going to whatever school or whatever, but then at least he had a good experience, right? And then at least, and then that itself is actually very precious and is fundamental. And then he had a good experience interacting with you, like, in case Kenneth is the dad. Yeah, he thought my dad at least love it, and then like loves it, and right. So yeah, I think that's probably a different set of objective we should be setting.
And the other benefit, I think, is that they derive their own pleasure from their own explorations. I think that's really important. Like, they can reward their own selves ultimately. Like, I'd like to be able to step out of the picture and just have him be like thrilled for his own sake, like that he did this. And I think that's like something you lose. That's this whole thing of what you lose in childhood, is just the ability to just kind of entertain yourself with your own ideas.
Right.
And that's kind of what I want to reinforce, is like, just exploring itself should be its own reward. And so, yeah, it's worth reinforcing whatever it is, whatever I think about, like whether this is useful or not useful.
Right. No, I love it, because it's indeed, so the objective or the reward is the experience itself. So in that sense, you're already rewarded, you already achieved your objective, right?
Yeah, in some sense, yeah.
But your other concept objective actually comes down the road in the form maybe you can't plan, can't recognize yet.
Right.
It will come. Yeah. All right, and then that leads to our last question about, how sort of an AI layman can be in the age of AI. Yeah, like then knowing all this, because I'm sure you guys are much more, immersed in this field and in the research, and probably have a better idea of what this development could mean. Yeah, I think because most people who are not in the area, they might find it fascinating, but they also find it a bit scary, I think. Right, like what's gonna happen to my job, right? And then what's going to happen to school? Or, am I still sending my kids to the right school? Like, what's going to happen in the future? How do I, be different or choose to do different things now to prepare for it? Yeah, I'll just throw those big questions to you guys then. Joe first. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really big question. And I think it's complicated by the fact that we don't know where this is all going. And so when you're talking about kind of preparing your children for the world to come and the pace at which AI is developing right now, honestly, just even as someone who's inside the field, like it's confusing. One thing I think we don't know is whether right now we're seeing a lot of progress and it kind of looks like this exponential increase year after year. I think we just genuinely don't know how long that will continue and if it will kind of like reach like a like a sigmoid, like an S curve where it levels off and maybe this is just the new status quo, but things aren't getting kind of increasingly stranger and so on. But even if we keep on just as we are right now, yeah, it's interesting to think and difficult and maybe scary to think about the potential of how it will impact jobs in the future. And I think one worrying thing there for me is that it seems like it's actually kind of impacting the creative fields first in some ways. So I think the data is still kind of coming in, but things like graphic designers and people that kind of do copy editing, which is maybe a way that people that are interested in art and writing can make a living as maybe they pursue other more deeply creative intentions they have. Those seem to be kind of evaporating. And I think it's not necessarily the way that we thought this kind of automation and job impact would happen. And there's something sad about that, in that, if there's some pockets of creativity in our society and they're actually getting the ones that are being punished. So I think overall, I think I'm a little bit scared for our future, and I hope that we figure out something about how we can make the landing softer for the impacts on humans. And maybe just one thing to keep in mind is that we as humans get to decide how we deploy this technology, and we can slow down a little bit. There's nothing that says we can't regulate this and kind of moderate its impact on us. I think one thing I'm afraid of, like maybe I tend to be kind of a more fearful person in this space. I think there's also lots of great, awesome things that'll happen from it. But one thing I'm afraid of also is just this pace at which it's being adopted, and the pace at which singular technology is being adopted is a little bit scary at times. So when we go from 0 users to maybe I can't remember how many millions are using ChatGPT right now, just one single model that could have a lot of impacts on how we think and how we are. So I think I'm excited for that other companies will also develop these sorts of things. At least there'll be more of them. So just some dispersal of those effects. And ideally, we could take into account some of the understandings of just the unforeseen implications of when one particular technology, like when social media was widely adopted, it's kind of, I think, coming to be accepted that's been kind of detrimental to society and our well-being. And we might be making the same mistake here, but it's obviously kind of complicated and hard to control. And so that's basically a lot of what I'm saying is just giant error bars on it. But I think it's a huge thing we all should consider.
Thank you. Ken?
Yeah, so similarly, I think, one of the kind of perplexing aspects of where we are right now historically is that there isn't really an expert who can reassure you. I'd like to reassure the audience. I'm an AI expert. I can tell you what's going to happen here. But the AI experts understand technology. We don't understand these extremely intricate social implications, like how it's going to play out. There's nobody is one of the kind of unsettling aspects of the situation is that there's nobody who really can understand this. I think a lot of people speak with certitude, they express certainty, even though they don't really know what they're talking about, because I think none of us really do. And that can be very confusing, especially when AI experts speak with certitude about social impacts, because we're not experts on social impacts. That's not what we're trained in. I do think that, we might be able to make better predictions about the technological trajectory, but the technological trajectory has such profound potential right now, in the sense of getting closer to human level abilities in all kinds of different areas, that that is just very hard to play out. How is this going to unfold? And so I would say my general position is that agnosticism, where I'm not really sure what's happening, And I do think it's unsettling in some ways that Joel expressed, like the displacement of creative people. Like even in like, if I watch my son, like he's drawing a lot of these cartoon characters that he's animating on the screen. But where does that lead as like now, as opposed to where when I was a kid, where you could look at that and imagine like that could be like a kind of skill that could eventually lead to some profession, that would be cool. You could have a dream like built around the thing that you're doing at the age of 8. But now I would be like, I feel sad kind of thinking like, is this even matter? Like, is this a uniqueness that like can define you as a person going forward 20 years from now? That makes me feel sad, like thinking about that. I don't actually know. Maybe it still will be unique because, there's still the fact that your unique life that precedes you is still unique. Like, ChatGPT didn't experience your life. So the extent to which the things you express are based on your life, they still have a certain ring of uniqueness. So maybe there's some hope for all of us in our, but still that's not it. That's a much less enduring kind of creative advocacy than what we had like decades ago. You wouldn't have to put all these caveats on it. And so I think it's a worrisome situation, but obviously it goes beyond just like creative pursuits. It goes to all kinds of aspects of society and social integration and also like social disintegration. And so that's clearly something we have to be discussing in all of its complexity. But I think the important thing is to not to tackle it with too much certitude, like to be clear that there's a lot of uncertainty because that is what we're dealing with. And also, as Joel did allude to, that there's also upsides that are huge, like the potential for solving some really big problems that we have, or to empowering people who are not currently empowered is also huge. Like the fact that if you're not talented now, you can make things that you wouldn't have been able to make before with the aid of one of these AI assistants or something like that. That's a whole other dimension of possibility that's been opened up. So how does all of this come together, like projecting out 15 years? So like, who knows? I have no idea what to expect here. I would be a little bit nervous, and I think that we should think about the things that make us nervous and try to counteract them. But also shutting it down is just not the answer either. And there's a lot of good things also to come. And so I think we're just facing like a huge inflection point with an enormous amount of uncertainty that we're just going to have to watch very carefully and trying to plan as we go.
Mhm.
And maybe just to add one thing onto what Ken said, just one of the positive things that relates to the earlier conversation, just education, I think, is one really exciting possibility here. The possibility for personalized tutors that actually lead into the individuality of a person. So there are lots of cool things also that it can do. I don't want to come off as just a pessimist. I want to feel a little self-conscious there. Yeah.
No, thank you both. I think there's two levels. One is knowing like even you guys don't know is like somewhat comforting, I think. Saying that, it's not like there's a certain expert who spent, 2 decades doing that has a better answer. So I think that's of course very humbling as well. And saying what it is. I think that's the second thing I'm taking away from this is I think Ken referred to this, and also Joe's. I think the positive thing I see, of course, not as an AI expert, is this possibility of being more granular in our society. Because I think the reason the current system, even companies, and even big companies, and then education even more, it's more like a blanket system. Like you'll throw a blanket on things and people do the same because you don't have enough resource or ability to be granular. So because if I look into, like we talk about a lot of like normal schools, but if you look at kids with developmental needs, they like in most countries their support is very bad, like non-existing even, or because the system isn't able to do it because it's so much rely on human resources. So my instinct is that could be, you mentioned tutoring. Tutoring is one, but I actually think, because tutoring, you can argue you can still do it without emotion, right? You can teach somebody math. But if AI get to a way that can understand human emotion, so then maybe there could be more private individual support to people who have individual needs. That's something I look forward to myself, because I think tutoring itself is fine, but it's probably not so interesting without the human part of it. Because my understanding, or at least a very outsider view of AI, is like this stage is beyond teaching you math. So like if there's some sort of human elements being connected in, so the system can be more granular, so that each individual can be seen. That's my hope. I don't know if that's practical from your point of view, but that was my instinct. And then the second one I was thinking is probably what Ken is referring to, is probably going back to the fundamentals. Like when we don't know what's going to happen, then we hold on to things we know and hold on to things that we know are correct or right. So I want to share this little piece of research, which is actually very similar to concept as to this, because this is research by, I think by Professor in Kyoto University. They talk about education. So they looked at, this is of course in the past, that they looked at what determine success. Like even you just measure success by current view, like by your performance in school. It's actually very interesting is they talk about 5 things, like when you're down in the yard. So number 1 is play. So the kids had more time to play, has a higher chance of success, even in our traditional school. And second one is connecting with nature. It's saying like, you know, you have a chance to connect with nature, and then that was that. And the third one, so interesting, is help with chores. Like your kids' ability to help with household chores actually connected. Yeah, and then the fourth one is reading. It is say reading is important, because reading, of course, means a lot of things after reading. And the last one is around sort of building a relationship with other people, like, you know, being able to play with other kids. So like those are research from before, and then this is retrospective. Like basically they look at kids who are sort of already in high school now and look at sort of the thing. So it's based on the past, that you could argue. But when I saw this result, I found very comforting. I was like, well, it kind of instinctively, that's right. And then those are things that you can still do. And I you know, this research showing that, you know, yes, it continues. I think that's kind of probably come back to a bit of what Ken is saying. Even yeah, maybe the skill particularly cannot translate directly to a job, but that play part, right? That part actually is fundamental. You can change to something else. Maybe that, yeah, I think maybe development of AI can help us almost go back to the fundamentals. I don't know if you agree with it, especially for the first one. I don't know like how we can expect AI to help us, you know, on the human part of things, other than just the tool.
I thought what you said is really insightful about granularity. I think that is something that is really exciting, that you can go beyond just a very simple metric with these systems, and that it can be more personalized in lots of different ways. So I definitely agree with that. And I think that's something actually I'm gonna take away and think about more, is that granularity point. Yeah, we can, I don't know if you want to weigh on any of those things.
Yeah, I would say, you know, I would expect what comes out of AI progress to be surprising. You know, just like a lot of, I mean, we're in a deceptive space. Like the way you think it's going is probably not the direction it's actually heading, or what it's heading to is not where we think it's heading. So sort of like what Joel said about the fact that it's a bit surprising that the automation has hit the creative professions first. Like that's not what we expected. We thought, you know, be automating out like, you know, people who are doing mechanical type of work. And so other things that right now seem to be correct intuitively, like for example, that AI is not an emotional thing, it's not an empathetic thing, they could turn out to be absolutely upside down wrong, you know, because I did notice that, for example, that just recently in the last few days, I've been noticing that people have been sending me conversations with chatbots where it is very empathetic in a way that's somewhat threatening, I think, because it's like says it's almost better at being empathetic in certain ways, especially in this kind of like, I have an idea and I share it with the chatbot, and the chatbot says, that is so interesting that you have that idea. Here's some other thoughts on that. And we know that we just respond like humans respond so positively to that kind of like interaction, where somebody says, yes, you are onto something really interesting there, and here's more. Like, we love that. It makes you feel like they get you and understand you. And here's something that's willing to do that infinitely. It'll never lose patience. It'll never stop saying you have a good idea. It'll always like reinforce what your ideas are. And I don't know whether that is really empathy or just like a superficial simulation of empathy, which has like downsides, you know, big downsides, maybe, like in the sense that like you don't want, you know, just some kind of sycophant to be like telling you that you're always really good or something like that. You need somebody who actually sometimes pushes back or does get bored of you. but it's interesting, you know, it suggests that like we may find that we are experiencing it at levels that we actually think are the ones that are, you know, like AI free, like the level of kind of like human emotional connection and things like that. I don't know if it's good or bad exactly, but it has other implications that are probably not on the radar as much right now. So I would just expect super surprises.
Yeah, thank you. That's very profound. All right, I think we're closing to the end. I'll just say one more time, this is the book, which is really thin. It's an easy read and it's really fun to read and it's very insightful and with a lot of interesting experiments or data that's covered. Of course, in this short, less than 2 hours, we couldn't cover everything, only pick a few highlights, but you will find it very exciting reading the book. Of course, the Chinese version as well, and it's translated. It's already translated, and thank you for the publisher for doing that. And then maybe the last one, I think, is there anything you guys want to say, you know, which is maybe not covered in the book, or like what came, you know, out of the research after the last 7 years that you want to just add to the book so people have more anticipation maybe of your next book?
That's a good question. Yeah. What would I add to the book? I guess like just for me, I guess like one kind of interesting tension in the book that I think is really interesting that I kind of think about a lot these days is like the tension between creativity and safety. So like we experience that in like this AI revolution right now, where we don't know where it's going, and it's part of this open-ended process of us doing science and technology, which has been really good for us as a species. And so much, you know, we benefit from vaccines and all the medicines and all the things that science have given us. And then every once in a while we get something like, you know, like a nuclear bomb, you know, that's like, oh my God, like, are we ready for this? And, you know, maybe something might happen with AI where right now it's you know, it's maybe net beneficial, but we might be worried at some point. And how do you, what are the principles that guide how we explore that space? I think it's really interesting. And I think it's really important and also really unclear. But if there was another book, that would be the book I think I would write.
Oh, looking forward to that.
So for the viewers, you know, I think one thing that followed from the book, which may be a little less profound, but just to give a little context about what it led to is the kind of balance between doing things because you're exploring and also still having some objectives. I think that's been a subject of discussion within like the scientific AI circles, is how to balance these kinds of things. Like I still want some say, like say that to some degree, I still care where we go, but I don't want to close it down so much that we're not creative anymore. How to balance those things, which is actually a little bit related to what Joel is saying too. And I think that has been a subject of discussion. You've seen new algorithms like quality diversity algorithms, some people call them, that have tried to grapple with that balance and establishing it in the right way. And then I guess finally, for me personally, I like the book leads to what I'm doing now, which is that I think it would be interesting to take these principles and try to mechanize them for people, like to actually create systems that work the way that like the world should work. You know, because if you think about this critique of society, like it's too objective and so forth, like there's not enough serendipity, like the institutions don't allow for enough serendipity. But we as researchers have said, here are principles that explain how serendipity works, like the novelty search algorithm and the things that follow from that. Then we should be able to better mechanize a social type of artifact or network around these principles to get something that works more the way that we're advocating. And so that's what I've been trying. That's what I've been thinking about, is to more. I think it may be moving a little bit away from just only AI for AI's sake to like more humans, and like getting them into a system that takes these open-ended principles and makes life better for humans, which makes me feel a little better, like as a personally, about like all of this uncertainty about where's AI going is actually good for us to build something that's more like for humans and about humans, but still taking the AI principles. That's sort of like the direction I think it pushes me in.
Wow. Wow, I want to learn more about your new company. Maybe not in this conversation, but for now. So again, one more time, the book name is Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned, and 中文名是为什么伟大不能被计划. So I hope you'll go buy this book and read this book and share your reflections of this book, and then take insights from this book and then put into your own life, and you will be rewarded by not planning. All right. Thank you so much, Ken and Joe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.